The tech entrepreneur was paralyzed when he heard the waitress singing a song in the restaurant, the same song his beloved used to sing before she disappeared 10 years ago. Martin Russell adjusted his Apple Watch, his gaze drifting absent-mindedly over the elegant dining room of The Grand, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. The soft clinking of crystal glasses and hushed conversations blended into a sophisticated atmosphere he had grown accustomed to over the years. But tonight, something felt off. He had come for a business dinner, yet his thoughts were elsewhere, locked in a past he had spent a decade trying to forget, or rather, trying to solve. The mystery of Victoria Shaw, his fiancée, who had vanished just days before their wedding, leaving behind nothing but questions and a gaping wound in his chest. Martin had done everything. He had hired the best private investigators, combed through every possible lead, even entertained theories that ranged from a tragic accident to something far more sinister. But after years of dead ends, even he had been forced to accept the inevitable. Victoria was gone. And then he heard it. A soft melodic hum weaving through the restaurant, threading itself into the air like a whisper from a forgotten dream. His pulse slammed against his ribs. That song, it wasn't just any tune. It was the lullaby Victoria always played on her piano when she was lost in thought, when she rested her head on his shoulder after a long day composing. A melody so unique that hearing it now sent an ice-cold shock through his spine. His body moved before his mind could catch up, scanning the restaurant with laser focus. His heart pounded against his ribs as his gaze locked onto the source of the melody, a waitress near the far end of the dining hall. She wasn't extraordinary at first glance. Dark brown hair pulled into a neat ponytail, simple uniform, graceful movements as she set down plates with practiced ease. But then she turned slightly, revealing a profile that made Martin's breath hitch. It was her, or at least someone who looked exactly like Victoria. Martin's hands curled into fists, his mind racing. This was impossible. Victoria had been missing for 10 years. She had vanished without a trace, and yet here she was, standing a few feet away from him, humming that damned lullaby like the past had never happened. For a long moment, he didn't move. He simply watched as the woman, Brooke, according to her name tag, went about her work, oblivious to his piercing stare. Every movement, every detail sent a fresh wave of disbelief crashing into him. Her eyes were the same shape, the curve of her lips, even the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, an old habit of Victoria's that he had once loved. And yet there was something different. Her posture was slightly more rigid, her expression unreadable. The way she carried herself wasn't quite the same. Could it really be Victoria, or was this just some cruel trick of fate? Martin's heart raced as he sat frozen in his chair, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Could it really be her? Could Victoria, the woman he had loved and lost, be standing just a few feet away from him? He had to know. He had to find out. Summoning his courage, Martin stood up, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor. His business partners at the table gave him curious glances, but he ignored them. His focus was locked on the waitress on Brooke. She was walking toward the kitchen, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. He followed her, weaving through the maze of tables, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Brooke turned, startled. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Martin felt like the world had stopped spinning. Those eyes, they were the same shade of hazel he had fallen in love with all those years ago. But there was no recognition in them, no flicker of familiarity. She looked at him like he was just another customer. "Yes, sir, can I help you?" she asked politely, her tone professional but distant. Martin hesitated, his throat dry. What could he say? That she looked exactly like his missing fiancée? That he had spent the last decade searching for her? He realized how insane it would sound, but he couldn't walk away now. I couldn't help but notice the song you were humming earlier," he said finally, his voice softer now. "It's beautiful. Where did you learn it? Brooke blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. Oh, that? I don't know. It's just something I've always known, I guess. It's familiar, but I don't remember where I picked it up. Her answer sent a chill down Martin's spine. She didn't remember. That song wasn't just any melody, it was Victoria's. She had written it herself. How could Brooke know it unless— I'm sorry, but— Have we met before? Martin asked, his voice trembling slightly. You look so familiar. Brooke tilted her head, studying him for a moment. Then she shook her head. I don't think so. I've only been in Chicago for a few years. Before that, I lived in a small town upstate. Maybe you're mistaking me for someone else. Martin's chest tightened. A small town upstate? That could explain why no one had found her all these years. But her response only deepened the mystery. If she was Victoria, why didn't she remember him? Why didn't she recognize the name? I'm sorry, Brooke said, her tone softening when she noticed the pained expression on his face. I hope I didn't upset you. No, it's fine, Martin said quickly, forcing a smile. You remind me of someone I used to know. Brooke gave him a small, apologetic smile before turning to leave, but Martin wasn't ready to let her go. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a photo, a worn, creased picture of him and Victoria, taken during a trip to Lake Tahoe. He stepped forward, holding it out to her. Wait, he said. Please, just look at this. Brooke hesitated, her eyes flicking to the photo. Slowly, she took it from him, her fingers brushing against his. She stared at the image, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Martin thought he saw something, a flicker of recognition, a shadow of memory, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I'm sorry, she said, handing the photo back to him. I don't know who this is. I really think you have the wrong person. Martin's heart sank, but he wasn't convinced. There was something in her voice, a hesitation, a crack in her otherwise calm demeanor. She might not remember, but deep down he was certain this was Victoria. Thank you, he said quietly, slipping the photo back into his wallet. I'm sorry for bothering you. Brooke nodded and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Martin stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. If she really was Victoria, then something terrible must have happened to her, something that had erased her memories, her identity, her entire life. He couldn't let it go. He wouldn't. He had spent 10 years searching for answers, and now, for the first time, he felt like he was close to the truth. But he couldn't do it alone. As he walked back to his table, Martin pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over a name he hadn't called in years. Detective Alan Brooks, the man who had investigated Victoria's disappearance all those years ago. The man who had told him to never give up hope. Martin pressed the call button, his jaw set with determination. If Brooke really was Victoria, then he was going to find out, no matter what it took. Martin sat in his car outside the Grand, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Martin Russell, came the gruff, no-nonsense tone of Detective Alan Brooks. It's been a while. It has, Martin replied, his voice steady but laced with urgency. I need your help, Alan. It's about Victoria. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Martin could almost hear the detective's mind working, piecing together the weight of his words. Victoria Shaw? Martin, it's been 10 years. What's going on? I think I found her, Martin said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Or someone who looks exactly like her. She doesn't remember me, Alan. She doesn't even know who she is. But it's her. I know it's her. The detective sighed, the sound heavy with skepticism. You're sure about this? You've been chasing ghosts for a decade. I don't want to see you get hurt again. I'm not imagining this, Martin insisted. She's working as a waitress at the Grand. She even hummed the song Victoria used to play. There's no way it's a coincidence. Another pause. Then finally, Alan said, "All right, I'll look into it, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that this might not be what you think." Martin exhaled, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Alan. I'll send you everything I have." The call ended, but Martin's mind was far from at ease. He leaned back in his seat, staring out at the city lights. If Brooke really was Victoria, then how had she ended up here? And why didn't she remember him or herself? The next morning, Martin met Alan at his downtown office. The detective's desk was cluttered with case files and coffee cups, a testament to his relentless work ethic. He looked older than Martin remembered, with more gray in his hair and deeper lines etched into his face, but his sharp eyes hadn't dulled. Alan leaned back in his chair, studying the photo Martin had handed him. It was the same picture Martin had shown Brooke, the one of him and Victoria at Lake Tahoe. "She does look like her," Alan admitted. "But looks can be deceiving. We need more than a resemblance." "I know," Martin said. "That's why I need you to dig into her past. She said her name is Brooke Wilson, and that she's been in Chicago for a few years. Before that, she lived in a small town upstate. She mentioned she doesn't remember much about her life before that." Alan raised an eyebrow. "Memory loss?" Martin nodded. "She said she was found in a hospital 6 years ago. No ID, no family, nothing. Just a blank slate." The detective's expression darkened. "That's unusual. Most people with amnesia have someone looking for them. Family, friends. If no one came forward, it means someone didn't want her to be found." Martin's stomach churned at the thought. "Do you think it's possible someone erased her past? That someone did this to her?" "It's possible," Alan said grimly. "But we need proof. I'll start with the hospital records. If she was admitted 6 years ago, there should be a paper trail. And if there isn't, well, that tells us something too." Over the next few days, Alan worked tirelessly, piecing together Brooke's fragmented history. Meanwhile, Martin couldn't stay away from the Grand. He found himself returning to the restaurant, watching Brooke from a distance, searching for any sign that she might remember him. One evening, as she cleared a table near the bar, he noticed something. A small scar on the back of her neck, just below her hairline. It was faint, almost invisible, but Martin recognized it immediately. Victoria had gotten that scar during a hiking trip when she slipped and hit her head on a rock. He had been the one to clean the wound, to hold her hand as she winced in pain. It was her. It had to be. But if it was, why didn't she remember? A week later, Alan called Martin with an update. "I found the hospital where she was admitted," the detective said. "It's a small facility in a town called Fairview, about 2 hours north of here. She was brought in by a good Samaritan who found her unconscious on the side of the road. No ID, no personal belongings. The doctors diagnosed her with retrograde amnesia, complete loss of memory." "Did they ever find out who she was?" Martin asked. "No," Alan replied. "But here's the strange part. The hospital records show that someone paid her medical bills in full, anonymously." Martin's grip on the phone tightened. "Who?" "I don't know," Alan said. "But I'm working on it. In the meantime, I found something else. Around the same time Brooke was admitted, a neurologist named Dr. Edwin Harrington was practicing in Fairview. He specialized in memory disorders, but his license was revoked 6 years ago after allegations of unethical practices." Martin's blood ran cold. "You think he had something to do with this?" "It's possible," Alan said. "If someone wanted to erase her memories, he would have been the man to do it." Martin's mind raced. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was darker than he had imagined. Someone had taken Victoria, had taken her memories, her identity, her life. And now, after all these years, he was finally getting close to the truth. But the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. Martin sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The weight of the past week pressed heavily on his shoulders. Brooke, no Victoria, was out there, living a life that wasn't hers, and someone had made sure of it. The anonymous payment for her hospital bills, the connection to Dr. Edwin Harrington, the amnesia, it all pointed to a deliberate act. But who would go to such lengths to erase her from his life? His thoughts kept circling back to one person, Lydia Russell, his older sister and the co-founder of his tech empire. Lydia had always been fiercely protective of their family's legacy, often to the point of ruthlessness. She had never approved of Victoria, claiming she was a distraction to Martin's career and a threat to their business. But could she really have been involved in something so sinister? Martin's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Alan. "I've got something," the detective said. "I dug into Lydia's financial records. 6 years ago, she made a series of large, untraceable cash withdrawals. The timing lines up with when Brooke Victoria was admitted to the hospital." Martin's stomach twisted. "You think she paid for the hospital bills?" "It's a strong possibility," Alan replied. "But that's not all. I also found a connection between Lydia and Dr. Harrington. She made a donation to his clinic a few months before his license was revoked, a substantial one." Martin's grip on the phone tightened. So she knew him. Feeling difficult. "He did," Alan confirmed. "And if I had to guess, she used him to make Victoria disappear." Martin's jaw clenched. He had always known Lydia was capable of manipulation, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. That evening, Martin arrived at Lydia's penthouse, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and determination. The doorman greeted him with a polite nod, but Martin barely acknowledged him as he stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors opened to reveal Lydia's sleek, modern living room. She was seated on the couch, a glass of red wine in hand, her sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights. She looked up as he entered, her expression cool and composed. "Martin," she said, setting her glass down, "to what do I owe the pleasure? You don't usually drop by unannounced." Martin didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to ask you something, and I want the truth." Lydia raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That sounds serious. What's on your mind?" "It's about Victoria," Martin said, his voice steady but cold. "I think you know more about her disappearance than you've let on." For a moment, Lydia's expression didn't change. Then she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Martin, it's been 10 years. Why are you dredging this up now?" "Because I found her," Martin said, stepping closer. "Or at least, I found someone who looks exactly like her, someone who doesn't remember who she is, and I have reason to believe you're involved." Lydia's smile faltered, but only for a second. She leaned back against the couch, crossing her legs. "That's quite the accusation. Do you have any proof?" "Alan found the payments," Martin said, his voice rising. "The cash withdrawals, the donation to Dr. Harrington's clinic. It all points back to you." Lydia's eyes narrowed, her calm demeanor cracking. "You've been digging into my finances? That's a dangerous game, little brother." "Not as dangerous as what you did to Victoria," Martin shot back. "Why, Lydia? Why would you do this? Was it because you didn't think she was good enough for me? Or was it because you were afraid she'd take me away from the company?" Lydia stood, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached him. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low and sharp. "Victoria was a liability. She was going to ruin everything we built. You were so blinded by love that you couldn't see it, but I could. I did what I had to do to protect you and the company." Martin stared at her, disbelief and anger swirling in his chest. "You had no right to make that decision for me. You destroyed her life. You destroyed our life." "She was holding you back," Lydia snapped. "You've accomplished more in the past 10 years than you ever would have with her by your side. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you?" Martin's voice was filled with fury. "You took away the one person I loved more than anything. You erased her, Lydia. Do you even realize what you've done?" Lydia's expression hardened. "I did what was necessary, and if I had to do it again, I would." Martin's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold. You might think you've won, but I'm going to fix this. I'm going to bring her back, and when I do, you'll have to answer for what you've done." Lydia smirked, her confidence unshaken. "Good luck with that. But let me give you a piece of advice, Martin. Sometimes the past is better left buried." Martin didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the penthouse, his mind racing. Lydia's confession had confirmed his worst fears, but it also gave him the resolve he needed. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let Victoria's life be stolen from her any longer. As he stepped into the elevator, his phone buzzed with a message from Alan. "Found something on Harrington. Call me ASAP." Martin's jaw tightened. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and he was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Lydia might have been the mastermind, but she wasn't working alone. Someone else had helped her, and Martin was going to find out who. Martin sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the message from Alan. The name, Dr. Edwin Harrington, had been haunting him ever since the detective first mentioned it. A disgraced neurologist with a history of unethical practices, Harrington was the missing link in the chain of events that had stolen Victoria's life. And now, Alan had found something. He dialed the detective's number, his heart pounding as the line connected. "Alan," Martin said, his voice sharp with urgency. "What did you find?" "I tracked down Harrington," Alan replied. "He's been living off the grid since his license was revoked, but I found an address. It's an old clinic in Fairview, the same town where Brooke Victoria was admitted to the hospital. I think he's still operating under the radar." Martin's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you think he's the one who erased her memories?" "It's likely," Alan said. "But we won't know for sure until we talk to him. I've already arranged for us to meet him tomorrow. Be ready." Martin nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll be there." The next day, Martin and Alan drove to Fairview, the tension in the car palpable. The small town was quiet, its streets lined with modest houses and overgrown yards. It was hard to believe that a man like Harrington, once a respected neurologist, had ended up here. The clinic was a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up and its sign faded with age. Martin felt a chill run down his spine as they approached the door. This was the place where Victoria's life had been stolen from her. Alan knocked firmly, and after a few moments, the door creaked open. A man in his 60s stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken. He looked like a shadow of the man he once was. "Dr. Harrington?" Alan asked. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between the detective and Martin. "Who's asking?" "I'm Detective Alan Brooks, and this is Martin Russell," Alan said. "We need to talk to you about a patient you treated 6 years ago, a woman named Brooke Wilson." Harrington's expression darkened and he started to close the door, but Martin stepped forward, his voice firm. "We know what you did. We know you erased her memories. We just want to know why and who paid you to do it." The doctor froze, his hand on the door. For a moment, Martin thought he was going to deny everything, but then Harrington sighed and stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. The inside of the clinic was as run down as the exterior, with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew. Harrington led them to a small office where he sank into a worn chair and rubbed his temples. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Don't lie to us," Alan said, his tone sharp. "We have evidence linking you to Brooke Wilson's case. We know you were paid to erase her memories. If you cooperate, we might be able to help you. But if you don't—" Harrington's shoulders slumped, and he let out a bitter laugh. "Help me? No one can help me. My career is over, my reputation is ruined, all because I made the mistake of trusting the wrong people." "Then tell us the truth," Martin said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Tell us what happened to her." The doctor hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't know her name," he said finally. "She was brought to me by a woman, a powerful woman. She said the girl was a danger to her family and needed to forget everything. She paid me a fortune to do it." "Lydia?" Martin said, his voice cold. Harrington nodded. I didn't ask questions. I just did what I was paid to do. I used a combination of drugs and hypnosis to suppress her memories. It wasn't perfect, there were always risks, but it worked. When she woke up, she didn't remember anything. Not her name, not her past, nothing. Martin's chest tightened as the weight of Harrington's words sank in. And then what? What happened to her after that? I was told to release her into the system, Harrington said. She was taken to the hospital, and that was the last I saw of her. I didn't want to know what happened after that. Martine's hands clenched into fists. You destroyed her life. You took everything from her. I didn't have a choice, Harrington said, his voice trembling. If I hadn't done it, they would have ruined me. And they did anyway. Martin wanted to scream, to lash out, but he forced himself to stay calm. Is there a way to reverse it? Can she get her memories back? Harrington hesitated, then nodded slowly. It's possible, but it's dangerous. The process could trigger severe trauma. She might not survive it. Martin's heart sank. He couldn't risk losing her again, but he also couldn't let her live a life that wasn't hers. What would it take? I'd need to see her, Harrington said. I'd need to assess her condition, but even then, there are no guarantees. Martin exchanged a glance with Alan, who gave him a small nod. We'll bring her to you, Martin said, but if anything happens to her, you'll answer to me. Harrington nodded, his expression grim. I understand. As they left the clinic, Martin's mind raced. He was one step closer to bringing Victoria back, but the road ahead was fraught with danger. He had to prepare her for what was coming, and he had to make sure Lydia paid for what she had done. Martin sat in his car outside Brooke's apartment, his mind a storm of emotions. The truth was finally within reach, but it came with a cost. Dr. Harrington's words echoed in his head. The process could trigger severe trauma. She might not survive it. He couldn't shake the fear of losing her again, but he also couldn't let her live a life built on lies. She deserved to know who she was, who they were. Taking a deep breath, Martin stepped out of the car and walked to her door. He knocked softly, and after a moment, Brooke opened it. She looked tired, her hair pulled into a loose bun, but her eyes softened when she saw him. Martin, she said, surprised. What are you doing here? I need to talk to you, he said, his voice steady but gentle. It's important. She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small but cozy, with warm lighting and a faint scent of lavender. Brooke motioned for him to sit on the couch, and she took a seat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. What's going on? She asked, her tone cautious. Martin hesitated, searching for the right words. I've been looking into your past, he said finally. I know you don't remember much about your life before 6 years ago, but I think I've found some answers. Brooke's brow furrowed. My past? Martin, I told you I don't remember anything. Why are you doing this? Because I think you're someone I used to know, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Someone I loved. Your name isn't Brooke Wilson. It's Victoria Shaw. Her eyes widened and she shook her head. That's not possible. I've never heard that name before. I know it sounds crazy, Martin said quickly, but I've spoken to people, doctors, investigators. I've found evidence. You were taken from your life, from me, and your memories were erased. That's why you don't remember. Brooke stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Martin, this doesn't make any sense. Why would someone do that to me? And because they wanted to keep us apart, he said, his voice breaking. My sister, Lydia, she thought you were a threat to our family's business. She paid a doctor to erase your memories and make you disappear. Brooke's hands trembled as she processed his words. No, she whispered. That can't be true. I'm not her. Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo, the same one he had shown her at the restaurant. He handed it to her. his heart pounding as she stared at it. "That's you," he said softly. "That's us, don't you see it?" Brooke's eyes filled with tears as she studied the photo. Her fingers traced the edges, and, for a moment, Martin thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her expression. But then she shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't remember," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't remember any of this." Martin leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "There's a way to bring your memories back," he said. "But it's risky. The doctor who erased them, he said he can reverse the process, but it could be dangerous." Brooke looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "Dangerous? How?" "It could trigger trauma," Martin admitted. "It might be too much for your mind to handle. But I can't make this decision for you. It has to be your choice." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the photo in her hands. Finally, she looked up at him, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "If there's a chance I can find out who I really am, I have to take it." The next day, Martin and Brooke met Alan at the clinic. Dr. Harrington was waiting for them, his expression grim as he led them into a small, sterile room. Brooke sat in the chair, her hands gripping the armrest tightly as Harrington prepared the equipment. "This will take time," the doctor said, his voice low. "And it won't be easy. Are you sure you want to do this?" Brooke nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I'm sure." Martin stood by her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I'm here," he said softly. "No matter what happens, I'm here." Harrington began the procedure, his voice calm as he guided Brooke through the process. He used a combination of hypnosis and sensory triggers, playing the melody she had hummed at the restaurant, showing her images of places she had once known. At first, there was nothing, just silence and confusion. But then, slowly, fragments began to surface. Brooke's breathing quickened as flashes of memory flooded her mind. A piano in a sunlit room, a man's voice calling her name, a ring on her finger. Tears streamed down her face as the memories came faster, more vivid, until they overwhelmed her. "Stop!" she gasped, her voice trembling. I can't." Harrington hesitated, glancing at Martin. "We're close," he said, "but it's up to her." Martin knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "You can do this," he said. "I know it's hard, but you're stronger than this. I'm right here with you." Brooke closed her eyes, her breathing slowing as she steadied herself. "Keep going," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrington continued. "And finally, the dam broke." Brooke let out a sob as the memories came rushing back, her life, her love, her pain. She remembered everything. And then, just as suddenly, she collapsed into Martin's arms, her body trembling. "It's her," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I'm Victoria." Martin held her tightly, his own tears falling as relief and love washed over him. "I knew it," he said, his voice breaking. "I knew it was you." But their relief was short-lived. As Harrington packed up his equipment, he turned to Martin, his expression grim. "There's something else you need to know," he said. "Lydia wasn't the only one involved in this. She had help." Martin's heart sank. "Who?" Harrington hesitated, then said, "Her father, George Shaw." Victoria's eyes widened, her body stiffening in Martin's arms. "My father," she whispered, "but he's dead." "No," Harrington said, "he's very much alive, and he's the one who orchestrated all of this." Victoria sat frozen in Martin's arms, her breath shallow as Dr. Harrington's words echoed in the room. Her father, George Shaw. The name felt like a ghost from a life she had only just begun to remember. Her mind raced, fragments of her past colliding with the present. She pulled back slightly, her wide eyes locking onto Harrington. "My father is dead," she said, her voice trembling. "He died in a car accident when I was a teenager. That's what I was told." Harrington shook his head, his expression grim. That's what you were meant to believe. But George Shaw didn't die. He disappeared. And he's the one who came to me 6 years ago, alongside Lydia Russell. Martin's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the back of Victoria's chair. Why would he do this? Why would her own father want to erase her memories? Harrington hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed. George Shaw was in deep trouble. Financially, legally. He was involved in some very dangerous dealings. He faked his death to escape his enemies, but he knew that if anyone found out he was alive, they'd come after his family. He believed Victoria was a liability. He thought she might lead them to him. Victoria's hands trembled as she tried to process the revelation. So he erased me? He erased my life to protect himself? Harrington nodded. He convinced Lydia to help him. She had her own reasons for wanting you gone, and together they made it happen. Lydia handled the logistics, and George provided the funding. I was just the tool they used. Martin's voice was cold, his anger barely contained. You're telling me that 2 people, one of them her own father, decided to destroy her life for their own selfish reasons, and you went along with it? Harrington looked away, shame etched into his features. I didn't know the full story at the time. I was desperate, and they offered me more money than I'd ever seen, but I regret it every day. Victoria stood, abruptly, her legs unsteady, but her voice firm. Where is he? She demanded. Where is my father now? Harrington hesitated, then said, I don't know exactly, but the last I heard he was living under a new identity in Europe. He's been moving around to stay off the radar. Victoria turned to Martin, her eyes blazing with determination. We have to find him. I need answers. Martin nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. We will, but first we need to deal with Lydia. She's still here, and she's not going to stop trying to control this. That evening, Martin and Victoria returned to his penthouse, the weight of the day pressing heavily on them. Victoria sat on the couch, staring out at the city lights, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent years living as Brooke Wilson, believing she was no one, and now she was Victoria Shaw again, a woman with a stolen past and a father who had betrayed her. Martin sat beside her, his hand gently covering hers. Are you okay? He asked softly. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know who I am anymore, she admitted. I thought finding out the truth would make me feel whole, but now I just feel lost. You're not lost, Martin said, his voice steady. You're Victoria. You're the woman I fell in love with, the woman I've been searching for all these years. And no matter what happens, I'm here for you. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and pain. I don't know how you've held on to hope for so long, she said. I don't know if I could have done the same. Martin smiled faintly. When you love someone, you don't give up on them, no matter how hard it gets. Victoria leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of safety, of belonging, but she knew their fight wasn't over. If they were going to reclaim her life, they had to confront the people who had taken it from her. The next morning, Martin called Alan to update him on what Harrington had revealed. The detective was as shocked as they had been, but he promised to dig into George Shaw's whereabouts. In the meantime, Martin and Victoria turned their attention to Lydia. She's not going to admit anything willingly, Martin said as they sat in his office going over their plan. But we have enough evidence to corner her. The financial records, Harrington's confession, it's all there. Victoria nodded, her jaw set with determination. I want to confront her myself. She needs to see what she's done to me. Martin hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in. Are you sure? She's dangerous, Victoria. She's not going to back down easily. I'm sure, Victoria said firmly. She's taken enough from me. It's time I take something back. That afternoon, they arrived at Lydia's office in the heart of the city. The receptionist tried to stop them, but Martin's sharp tone left no room for argument. They pushed through the doors to Lydia's private office, where she sat behind her sleek desk, her expression cool and composed. "Well, this is a surprise," Lydia said, leaning back in her chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Victoria stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You know why we're here." Lydia's gaze flicked to Martin, then back to Victoria. "I see Harrington's been talking," she said, her tone dismissive. "I warned him not to get involved." "You don't get to brush this off," Victoria said, her voice rising. "You stole my life. You erased me. And for what? To protect your precious company? To keep Martin under your control?" Lydia's expression hardened. "You don't understand the sacrifices I've made for this family. For Martin. You were a distraction, Victoria. You would have dragged him down, and I couldn't let that happen." "You don't get to decide what's best for me," Martin said, his voice cold. "You crossed a line, Lydia, and now you're going to pay for it." Lydia smirked, her confidence unshaken. "And what exactly are you going to do? Go to the police? Good luck proving anything. Harrington's a disgraced doctor, and the rest of your so-called evidence is circumstantial at best." Martin stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't underestimate me, Lydia. I've spent 10 years fighting to find her, and I'm not going to stop now. You might think you're untouchable, but you're not." Victoria's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. "You might have taken my memories, but you didn't take my strength. I'm not afraid of you, Lydia, and I'm not going to let you control me anymore." For the first time, Lydia's composure faltered. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Martin's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Alan. "Found George Shaw. Call me." Martin's heart raced as he looked at Victoria. "It's your father," he said. "Alan found him." Victoria's eyes widened, a mix of fear and determination flashing across her face. "Then it's time to finish this." Martin and Victoria sat in the car, the weight of Alan's message hanging heavily between them. The detective had tracked George Shaw to a secluded estate in the French countryside, far from the life he had once lived. The thought of confronting her father filled Victoria with a mix of dread and determination. She had spent years believing he was dead, only to discover that he had orchestrated the destruction of her life. Now she was about to face him. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Martin asked, his voice soft but steady as he glanced at her. Victoria stared out the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I have to do it. I need to hear the truth from him. I need to know why he did this." Martin reached over, his hand covering hers. "You're not alone in this. Whatever happens, I'm right here with you." She turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The flight to France was long and tense, but Martin and Victoria barely spoke. Both were lost in their thoughts, preparing for what lay ahead. When they arrived, Alan was waiting for them at the airport, his expression grim. "The estate is heavily guarded," he explained as they drove through the winding countryside. "Shaw's been living under the name Charles Devereux. He's got a small staff, but they're loyal to him. We'll need to be careful." Victoria nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I don't care how many guards he has. I'm going to see him." Alan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his respect for her resolve evident. "We'll get you in," he said, "but once you're inside, it's up to you." The estate was a sprawling property, surrounded by high walls and dense trees. Alan had arranged for a discreet entry, using his connections to bypass the guards. As they approached the main house, Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. The building was grand and imposing, its stone facade weathered by time. It was hard to believe that the man who had once been her father was inside. Alan stopped the car a short distance from the house, and they got out. "This is as far as I go," he said. "I'll stay here and keep an eye on things. If anything goes wrong, call me." Martin nodded, then turned to Victoria. "Are you ready?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Let's do this." The door was opened by a middle-aged woman who appeared to be the housekeeper. She looked at them with suspicion but didn't stop them as they stepped inside. The interior of the house was elegant but cold, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling. Victoria's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of her father. "Who are you?" a deep voice demanded from the top of the staircase. Victoria's breath caught as she looked up. A man stood there, his hair gray and his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking him. It was George Shaw. Her father. The man she had thought was dead. "Victoria?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief as he descended the stairs. "Is it really you?" She took a step forward, her emotions warring within her. "You tell me," she said, her voice trembling. "Am I Victoria? Or am I just the person you erased?" George stopped in his tracks, his face pale. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "That's because you made sure of it," she said, her voice rising. "You erased my memories. You took my life away. Why, Dad? Why would you do that to me?" He looked away, his shoulders slumping. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "I did it to protect you." "Protect me?" she repeated, her voice filled with anger. "You didn't protect me. You destroyed me. You let me believe I was no one. You let me live a lie." George's eyes filled with pain as he looked at her. "I had no choice," he said. "I was in trouble, serious trouble. If anyone found out I was alive, they would have come after you. I couldn't let that happen." "So you erased me instead?" she said, her voice breaking. "You thought that was better? That I'd be safer if I didn't even know who I was?" "I thought it was the only way," he said, his voice trembling. "I thought you'd be able to start over, to live a life free from the danger I brought into your world." Victoria shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't give me a life, you took it away. You let me believe I was nothing, and for what? To save yourself?" George's face crumpled, and he sank into a nearby chair. "I know I failed you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong. I've regretted it every day." Martin stepped forward, his voice cold. "Regret doesn't change what you did. You didn't just hurt her, you hurt both of us. You stole years of our lives." George looked up at him, his expression filled with guilt. "I know," he said, "and I'll never forgive myself for it." Victoria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I didn't come here for your apologies," she said. "I came here for answers. I need to know everything. Who else was involved? What else have you been hiding?" George hesitated, then nodded. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "But you need to understand it wasn't just me. Lydia played a bigger role than you realize. She was the one who convinced me to go through with it. She said it was the only way to protect the family." Victoria's hands clenched into fists. "Lydia," she said, her voice filled with venom. "Of course she was involved." "She's dangerous," George said. "More dangerous than you know. She's been pulling the strings for years, manipulating everyone around her. If you're going to go after her, you need to be careful." Martin stepped closer, his voice firm. "We are not afraid of her. She's going to pay for what she's done." George looked at them, his expression a mix of fear and admiration. "You're stronger than I ever was," he said. "I'll help you in any way I can. But you need to promise me one thing." "What?" Victoria asked, her voice cold. "Don't let her destroy you," he said. "She'll do whatever it takes to protect herself. Don't underestimate her." Victoria stared at him, her emotions swirling. She had spent years longing for her father, only to find a man who had betrayed her in the worst way. But as much as she hated him for what he had done, she couldn't deny the pain in his eyes, the pain of a man who had lost everything. "I don't need your protection anymore," she said finally. I'm not the girl you erased. I'm stronger than that. And I'm going to take back what's mine." George nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I believe you," he said. "And I'm sorry." Victoria turned away, her heart heavy but resolute. She had found the truth. But her fight wasn't over. Lydia was still out there, and she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Victoria and Martin returned to the United States with a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with George Shaw had given them the answers they needed, but it had also revealed the true scope of Lydia's betrayal. She wasn't just complicit, she was the mastermind behind everything. Victoria's stolen life, George's disappearance, and even the lies that had kept Martin in the dark for so long. It all led back to Lydia. As they sat in Martin's penthouse, going over their plan, Victoria's resolve hardened. "She's not going to stop," she said, her voice steady. "As long as she's free, she'll keep trying to control everything. We have to end this." Martin nodded, his expression grim. "We will. But we need to be smart about it. Lydia's powerful, and she's not going to go down without a fight." Alan, who had joined them after their return, leaned forward in his chair. "I've been digging into her finances and business dealings," he said. "There's enough evidence to implicate her in several illegal activities, fraud, embezzlement, even bribery. But it's not enough to tie her directly to what she did to Victoria. We need something stronger." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll get it. She's been hiding in the shadows for too long. It's time to bring her into the light." The next day, Martin arranged a meeting with Lydia at her office. He didn't tell her that Victoria would be coming too. He wanted to catch her off guard, to force her to confront the truth she had worked so hard to bury. When they arrived, Lydia was waiting for them in her sleek, modern office, her expression cool and composed as always. She rose from her chair, her sharp eyes flicking between Martin and Victoria. "Well, this is unexpected," she said, her tone icy. "I didn't realize you'd be bringing a guest." Victoria stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not a guest," she said. "I'm the person you tried to erase." Lydia's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. "I see Harrington's been talking," she said, her voice calm. "I warned him not to get involved." "You can stop pretending," Martin said, his voice cold. "We know everything. We know what you did to Victoria, what you did to my family. It's over, Lydia." Lydia's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You think you've won," she said. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of something without proof. You have no idea what you're up against." Victoria stepped closer, her voice sharp. "We have more than you think," Harrington confessed. "We have financial records, emails, and witnesses. You can't hide anymore." Lydia's smile faded, and her expression hardened. "You're making a mistake," she said. "You don't understand the sacrifices I've made for this family. Everything I've done to protect us, to protect Martin." "Protect me?" Martin said, his voice rising. "You didn't protect me. You manipulated me. You lied to me. You destroyed the woman I loved. That's not protection, that's control." Lydia's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't know what it's like to carry the weight of this family," she said. "To make the hard decisions. I did what I had to do." "No," Victoria said, her voice steady. "You did what you wanted to do. You didn't care about anyone but yourself. And now you're going to pay for it." Lydia's gaze shifted to Victoria, her expression cold and calculating. "You think you can take me down?" she said. "You're nothing. You're a ghost. No one will believe you." Victoria's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Martin stepped forward, his voice firm. "You're wrong," he said. "We have everything we need to expose you, and when we do, you'll lose everything." Lydia's composure finally cracked, and she let out a bitter laugh. "You think you're so righteous," she said. "But you're just as ruthless as I am. You're willing to destroy your own sister to get what you want." Martin's eyes narrowed. You stopped being my sister the moment you decided to destroy Victoria. This ends now." As they left Lydia's office, Victoria felt a surge of adrenaline. For the first time, she felt like she was taking control of her life, standing up to the person who had stolen it from her. But she knew the fight wasn't over. Lydia wouldn't go down without a fight, and they needed to be ready for whatever she threw at them. Back at the penthouse, Alan was waiting for them with an update. "I've been monitoring Lydia's movements," he said. "She's already trying to cover her tracks. She's moving money around, deleting files, and contacting her allies. She knows we're coming for her." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to move fast. What's our next step?" Alan hesitated, then said, "There's one more piece of evidence we need." Harrington mentioned that Lydia kept a journal, a record of everything she's done to protect herself. "If we can find it, it'll be the nail in her coffin." "Where is it?" Martin asked. Alan sighed. "That's the problem. It's in her house, and it's not going to be easy to get to." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll go in and get it." Martin shook his head. "No, it's too dangerous. Lydia's not going to let you anywhere near her house." "She won't know I'm there," Victoria said. "I know her. I know how she thinks. If anyone can find that journal, it's me." Martin hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his trust in her. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but you're not going alone. I'm coming with you." That night, under the cover of darkness, Martin and Victoria approached Lydia's sprawling estate. Alan had provided them with the security codes and a layout of the house, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. Lydia's guards were well trained, and the house was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance. As they slipped inside, Victoria's heart pounded in her chest. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the security system. They moved quickly but carefully, searching for the hidden safe where Lydia kept her journal. After what felt like an eternity, they found it a small concealed compartment behind a painting in Lydia's study. Martin worked quickly to open the safe, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. When the door finally swung open, Victoria reached inside and pulled out the journal. "We've got it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Lydia's guards had found them. "Run," Martin said, grabbing Victoria's hand. They sprinted through the house, dodging the guards as alarms blared around them. Victoria's heart raced as they burst through the front door and into the night. Alan was waiting for them in the car, and they jumped in as he sped away. Back at the penthouse, they opened the journal and began to read. It was all there, every lie, every betrayal, every crime Lydia had committed to protect herself and her empire. It was more than enough to bring her down. Victoria closed the journal, her hands trembling. "It's over," she said, her voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. "We have everything we need." Martin wrapped his arms around her, his voice soft. "You did it," he said. "You took your life back." Victoria leaned into him, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, she felt free. Lydia's reign of control was over, and Victoria was finally ready to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. The morning after obtaining Lydia's journal, Victoria, Martin, and Alan met with District Attorney Sarah Chen. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, not just the journal, but financial records, witness statements, and Harrington's testimony. It was enough to build a solid case against both Lydia and those who had helped her. "This is extraordinary," Chen said, flipping through the documents. "We're looking at multiple felony charges, conspiracy, fraud, medical malpractice, and possibly even kidnapping. Ms. Russell won't be able to buy her way out of this one." Victoria sat straight-backed in her chair, her voice steady. "How long will it take?" "We can move quickly," Chen replied. "Given the high-profile nature of the case and the evidence we have, I'd like to proceed with the arrest today. Are you prepared for what comes next?" "This will be public, and it will be messy." Martin reached for Victoria's hand, squeezing it gently. "We're ready," The arrest of Lydia Russell made headlines across the city. News cameras captured her being led out of her office in handcuffs, her perfectly composed facade finally cracking. But it wasn't just Lydia. Several of her associates were also taken into custody, including members of the medical board who had helped cover up Harrington's illegal procedures. Victoria watched the news coverage from Martin's penthouse, her emotions a mix of relief and vindication. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said softly. Martin wrapped his arms around her. "You did it. You fought back, and you won." But their victory was bittersweet. As the story broke, more details emerged about the extent of Lydia's crimes. She hadn't just targeted Victoria. There were other victims, other lives she had manipulated and destroyed in her quest for power and control. The preliminary hearing was set for the following week. Victoria sat in the courtroom, her head held high as Lydia was brought in. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, Victoria saw something she had never seen in Lydia's eyes before: fear. The evidence was presented methodically. Chen laid out the case with precision, using Lydia's own words from her journal to demonstrate the calculated nature of her crimes. When Victoria took the stand to testify, her voice never wavered as she recounted the years of her stolen life. "She didn't just take my memories," Victoria said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "She took my choice, my identity, my future. She made me believe I was no one, all while watching me struggle to find myself. That kind of cruelty, it's beyond forgiveness." Lydia's defense tried to paint her actions as protective measures for her family's interests, but the argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. When the judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges, Lydia's composed exterior finally shattered completely. As she was led away, she turned to Martin, her voice breaking. "I did it for you," she said. "Everything I did was to protect you." Martin's response was cold. "No, Lydia. You did it for yourself, and now you'll pay for it." In the days that followed, Victoria began the process of reclaiming her identity legally. Her real name was restored, and, with Martin's help, she started to rebuild the life that had been taken from her. But there was one more piece of unfinished business: her father. George Shaw had agreed to testify against Lydia in exchange for a reduced sentence. When Victoria visited him at his temporary residence under police protection, she found him looking older and more vulnerable than ever. "I've given them everything," he said, his voice tired. "All the records, all the contacts. I know it doesn't make up for what I did to you, but I hope it helps bring some justice." Victoria studied him, her emotions conflicted. "You know I can't forgive you," she said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "I know. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that watching you fight back, watching you reclaim your life, I've never been prouder. You're stronger than I ever was." Victoria felt tears stinging her own eyes. "I had to be," she said softly. "I had to be strong enough for both of us." The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, Lydia was found guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence was severe: 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. George received a lighter sentence due to his cooperation, 10 years, with possibility of parole after 5. As Victoria left the courthouse for the last time, reporters called out questions, cameras flashing, but she walked past them with her head high, Martin by her side. They had won, but more importantly, they had survived. That evening, they stood on the balcony of Martin's penthouse, looking out over the city lights. Victoria felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning into Martin's embrace. He kissed her temple softly. "Whatever you want. Your life is yours again. You can do anything, be anyone." She turned to face him, her eyes shining. "I already know who I am," she said. "I'm Victoria Shaw, and I'm finally free." Months had passed since the trial, and life had begun to settle into a new rhythm for Victoria. The chaos of the courtroom, the media frenzy, and the emotional toll of confronting her past were behind her now. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. But the question remained, what would she do with this second chance at life? Victoria stood in the middle of her new apartment, a cozy space filled with sunlight and warm tones. It wasn't as grand as Martin's penthouse, but it was hers, a place she had chosen for herself. She ran her fingers over the edge of a framed photo on the table, a picture of her and Martin taken during a quiet weekend getaway to the countryside. It was a reminder of how far she had come and the people who had stood by her. One afternoon, Victoria decided to visit the home she had grown up in, the house she had shared with her father before his supposed death. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay as George Shaw disappeared into his new life. Walking through the overgrown garden and stepping into the dusty, silent rooms, she felt a wave of nostalgia mixed with sadness. In her old bedroom, she found a box of keepsakes tucked away in the closet. Inside were fragments of her childhood, a music box, a stack of letters, and a photo album. As she flipped through the pages, memories came flooding back. Her mother's laughter, her father's stern but loving gaze, and the life she had once believed was perfect. But as she closed the album, she realized something important. That life was gone, and no amount of looking back could bring it back. What mattered now was the life she was building for herself, the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Victoria had always been drawn to music. Even during the years she had lived as Brooke Wilson, she had found solace in singing, even if she didn't know why. Now, with her memories restored, she understood. Music had been a part of her soul, a connection to the person she had always been. With Martin's encouragement, she began to pursue her passion again. She started small, performing at local venues and sharing her story through her songs. Her voice carried the weight of her experiences, and audiences were captivated by the raw emotion in her performances. One evening, after a particularly moving show, a woman approached her backstage. "Your music. It's like you're telling my story," the woman said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for sharing it." Victoria smiled, her heart full. For the first time, she felt like her pain had a purpose, that by sharing her journey, she could help others find strength in their own struggles. Martin had been her rock through everything, and their bond had only grown stronger in the months since Lydia's downfall. But as much as Victoria loved him, she knew she needed to stand on her own 2 feet before fully committing to their future together. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of his penthouse, Martin turned to her, his expression serious. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us, about what's next." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I love you, Victoria. I've loved you since the moment I met you, and I never stopped. But I know how important it is for you to find yourself again. I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Martin, you've been by my side through everything. I wouldn't be here without you. But you're right. I need to figure out who I am, who I want to be, before we take the next step." He nodded, his love for her evident in his gaze. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting." Victoria's relationship with her father remained complicated. He was serving his sentence in a minimum secondary prison, and while she had visited him a few times, their conversations were strained. She couldn't forget what he had done, but she also couldn't deny the part of her that still longed for the father she had once loved. On her final visit before his parole hearing, George looked at her with a mixture of hope and regret. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, "but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You've become everything I always hoped you would be." Victoria studied him for a long moment before replying. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said honestly, "but I'm learning to let go of the anger. It's not for you, it's for me. I need to move on. George nodded, tears in his eyes. That's all I could ever ask for. A year after Lydia's conviction, Victoria stood on the stage of a packed theater, her heart pounding as the lights dimmed. This was her biggest performance yet, a culmination of months of hard work and self-discovery. As the first notes of her song filled the air, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her music told the story of her journey, the pain of losing herself, the fight to reclaim her identity, and the hope of a brighter future. When the final note faded, the audience erupted into applause, and Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. She had found her voice again, not just as a singer, but as a person. Backstage, Martin was waiting for her, a proud smile on his face. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into his arms. Victoria looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I finally feel like myself again," she said, "and I'm ready for whatever comes next." Martin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Then maybe it's time for this," he said, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Victoria Shaw, will you marry me?" Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she smiled, her heart full. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, 1,000 times yes. Years later, Victoria stood in the garden of their home, watching as their young daughter played among the flowers. Martin joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist as they looked on. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked softly. Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with sadness anymore. It's part of who I am, but it doesn't define me. What matters is this our life, our family." Martin kissed her temple, his voice filled with love. "You are the strongest person I know, Victoria, and I'm so proud of you." She smiled, leaning into him as their daughter's laughter filled the air. For the first time in years, Victoria felt truly whole. Her past had shaped her, but it no longer controlled her. She had reclaimed her life, her identity, and her future, and it was brighter than she had ever imagined.